And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, and his commandments, and his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself. Welcome back to Bookwave, the book club podcast. I'm your host, Scott, joined today by Pat.
Hey,
Jason.
Glad to be here with my friends.
And William.
Howdy.
We're all back together for another video of the Holy Bible Book Club series. Today we're looking at the first book of Kings. And in this book we're introduced to the character of Solomon. So my first question to either one of you, whoever wants to start us off, and to anybody listening at home, what do you think was the greatest example of the wisdom of Solomon? Because I didn't really see much, so I'm curious to see what you guys have to say about it.
Well, I think one of the wisest actions I saw in this book was that he had 300 concubines in addition to his 700 wives. That alone is like top level wisdom right there.
Yeah, next level, top tier.
I mean, establishing trade routes with Lebanon to build the first temple for the tabernacle, or for the Ark of the Covenant to replace the tabernacle, that was pretty brilliant. You know, having a 3-month, 10,000 slaves per month revolving trade system with Lebanon to be able to have the resources and labor to get the cedar and the gold and brass and the olive trees and all that. That was pretty wise.
Yeah, there was a little bit of controversy there with all the forced labor and this and that. So
it is a controversial book.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, I think they broke one of the Deuteronomic rules in taking those slaves.
Yeah, because it said the slaves shall come from the countries around you, when it describes that the Israelites and the Judites themselves were all working on this temple for Solomon. What do you think, Pat?
I was leaning towards Solomon's temple because for some reason it just reminded me of another book that I've read a long time ago called The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, and it's kind of like a safe haven in a way, where a lot of people who are left astray are welcome to this environment. And even though the tendency to abandon God's commandments and everything and just splurge out doing whatever, it's kind of like a down-to-earth kind of heaven, if that makes any sense, where it's, how should I say this? It seems like no matter what we lead or govern to, it always comes back to God's guidelines. And whether or not we are leaders, all the effectiveness depends on just listening and paying attention without putting forth your personal desires first. And then just let everything around you just let everything engulf you, and so to speak.
I think I like that better than the 1,000 ladies answer.
Might be a little bit more inspiring.
The temple definitely showed an element of his wisdom and the craftsmanship of the time, because this was back somewhere around 800 BC, and Solomon was only 15 when he took over as king. So I don't know at what age he was when he started building the temple. I think possibly in his early 20s. But imagining myself in my early 20s, I wasn't, obviously I wasn't a king, but managing and coordinating that kind of construction definitely is not an easy task. And they go into great detail in this book about how the temple was built. And like you said, Pat, that it was kind of meant to be a reflection from what I read into it, like a reflection of the Garden of Eden, where God and earth meet, and it's supposed to be splendid. The room is covered in gold. It definitely would have been a sight to see.
Kind of explains why everything's covered in gold, that he's so young. Because I don't know if you've ever played Minecraft, but that's the first thing you do is you build a house out of gold as a child in Minecraft. And it's like the exact same thing with Solomon and his temple. He's like, oh, okay, we'll build these things, they'll be 25 feet tall, and then we'll cover them with gold. And then we'll build this thing, and we'll cover it with gold. And then we'll build this thing, and there will be 400 pomegranates. It's like, okay, Solomon, whatever you want.
Yeah,
Guy was bringing in like $250 million a year. My Bible sort of annotates and approximates how much the donations were of everything that he's getting from the queens that are visiting him and everything that he's selling. And it's like, okay, so he's bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars, and he wants his gold temple. Okay.
yeah.
So how does that work? I mean, what kind of, they have a monarchy, so basically everyone underneath is paying tribute to the king in this situation.
Yeah, I guess so. And then like also he's getting gifts from other foreign queens and kings for
Yeah,
some
well,
reason.
and like the example where he takes all of the wives from the surrounding lands, then their fathers are going to be like, well, I want my daughter to be happy, married to this great king in Israel or whatever. So, I'm gonna give their people some presents, so they'll treat my daughter better than the other 1,000 girls that he's got hanging around. And
Plus all the
that's when like characters like Jezebel come in, being like, oh, one of Solomon's favorites or whatever, or not
right.
Solomon. I think it's down the line with Ahab, I believe.
But like also he has navy raids going out and lots of ships that are just going, and every 4 months they bring back a whole bunch of gold and a whole bunch of spices
And women.
and women.
Yeah.
All of the gold decorating the temple, and these tributes being paid to him and the favors being given to him kind of remind me of a certain ex-president that we have. But I don't want to get into that. One thing I did find interesting is after he finishes the temple, he starts building his palace at the same level of extravagance as God's temple. So he's starting to like treat himself, putting himself on the same pedestal as God, and giving himself all this gold and hundreds of baths at his palace.
Yeah, that wasn't very wise.
Yeah, but it just goes through the example we see over and over again, no matter where we look, just the corruption of power. Like Julius Caesar, same thing happened to him. He made statues of himself, declared himself a god. They stabbed him for it, so there's no doubt that war is going to come from someone saying, I am on the same level as the God that you all worship, so I deserve all this worship just as much as he does. Going right against the teachings of David that we've already talked about.
Yeah, that kind of answers one of the questions I had, was how somebody so wise can fail so horribly in a moral sense. And like you said, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty shortly after that Solomon becomes king, he is shown to he's shown as a judge with two women that are arguing amongst themselves about whose baby is what. And then right after that, that's when he starts building the temple and the palace, and things start falling apart pretty much right away after that.
Mm-hmm. But you do get like one little example of Solomon's wisdom there, because you have the two mothers saying like, hey, this is my kid. No, this is my kid. Because one of them died. They were both mothers. They both have a child. One of the children dies. So now you have these two women that are saying, this is my kid. Yours is the one that died. And so they take it to King Solomon, and he says, you know, maybe I'll just chop it in half so you can each have half the kid. Seems fair? And of course, the actual mother says, no, don't chop it in half. She can have the kid. It's okay. And the one who was just trying to basically kidnap the child says, yeah, slice it right down the middle. Good enough for me. If I can't have it, no one will. So Solomon obviously awards the child to the one who had the best interest of the kid in heart. So that can be considered wisdom, or it could be considered common sense. Don't give a child to someone who's willing to chop it in half, regardless of whether or not that's the mother. I mean, come on.
Yeah. It's kind of amusing in a way, just listening to those choices. Or those people who come to you and present to you a problem. They argue back and forth, and it's no longer a form of like, okay, how do we solve this? It's like, it's almost like putting on a show for the king. It's very amusing.
Definitely one of those things. It's like, if you didn't have a king, right? Like, no one's taking their baby to Justin Trudeau and saying, this is my kid. No, it's not. This is my kid. No, it's not. Like, no one's doing that. We're not even really going to court and doing that, because it's not as much of a spectacle as it would be to go to the king of the land and have him solve your problem. And I think that might be the flaw in the system of having a king and judge. Like, and
that's interesting.
You know, separation of church and state, but
yeah, that's interesting. Just the fact that it presents the option of the king can solve your problems. That
yeah. It's like getting Oprah to fix your problems. It's like, even if she doesn't fix your problems, you get to meet Oprah.
Yeah. And that's going to be a moment that you get to tell all your friends about for the rest of your life. I was on TV, you know. I can show you the episode of Oprah where I was on there. Like,
and it's like,
I met the king. I met the king once. Oh, what a grand day that was. He chopped my kid in half, but I got to meet the king.
Yeah, exactly, because it's like, now it's like, okay, so people are creating opportunities to meet the king. So now, because you have a king who's a judge, you've created a culture and a society in which people want to create spectacles of themselves and get your attention and get a front row seat in your court and have you talk to them. And it's like, that's not the role of the king.
Yeah.
When I was reading this, I was imagining what the outcome would have been if, instead of the king making the decision, they had just asked the prophets to, ask God to intervene, essentially, and have God make the decision regarding the baby.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
And is it when Solomon decides to turn away from God after that incident?
It may have bolstered his ego, instead of asking God, what should we do here? Because in this First Kings, the prophets ask God numerous times for advice, and the word of God comes to them and gives them what the best solution would be. So I don't know why they didn't do that, but I think at this point with Solomon, they're trying to show that he's starting to take the path that separates him from walking with God.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, he's only using the tools that the Bible tells us God himself bestowed upon Solomon. So, to take matters into your own hands and, use your own wisdom could be interpreted as like, oh, he wasn't trusting in God at that moment, but it could also be interpreted as, he was using the tools that God gave him to make his decision. So, I don't know. Because it does present, like, the wisdom of Solomon being something that was gifted to him by God. Like, I was talking about before we started recording. Like, it reminds me a lot of the Shazam comics. He's got the strength of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus. It's like all of these otherworldly gifts that Solomon has that he's using to make these decisions, but ultimately it leads him to worship Baalim and Ashtaroth, and it doesn't go well for him. There's too many gods in his house, and all of his wives are telling him we need to worship these different deities.
It also says that he builds the walls of Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, so David had started building Jerusalem, and the cities back then were kind of a circle. And so you had an inner circle with the city center there, and then you had an outer circle, and there was a gap between those two circles where people lived. So I think when they said he built the walls, they're talking about that outer defensive wall.
Yeah, because, like, David built the house of Jerusalem or whatever, the house of Zion, and then Solomon continued to fortify it in his reign. And both of their reigns lasted 40 years exactly, if you pay attention to the scripture and what all the math it gives you.
Right.
But we've also talked about some of the math in the Bible and how Dr. Asimov calls them out for, getting pi wrong by about 1.4.
0.14.
Yeah, 0.14, sorry. But yeah, there's
I
there's a description of a basin that has the circumference of, I forget the exact numbers now. You had them.
Circumference 30, diameter 10, depth 5, cubits.
Yeah, and of course, if it was accurate by the standards of pi, the circumference wouldn't be 30, it would be 31.4, yada, 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 but there's
31.14159.
There's keep going, bud. But there's one easy, like really easy way to explain it. They were measuring with their forearms to their fingertip. You ever read cubit in the Bible? This is what it is. This is a cubit. And pro tip, not everybody's cubit is the same length. So we really don't know if they were using like meter sticks or rulers or how exactly they were doing it, but when it came down to rough estimations, it sounded a lot better to say it was, 10 by 30 than 10 by 31.4 decimal point later on. So, all of the atheists like to say, well, if this is the word of God, then God's pretty bad at math. But come on, be realistic here.
Well, it's the Holy Bible. It's not the holy how to do math book.
Yeah, this isn't Euclid's Elements here.
Like, they're not trying to teach you math. That's not the message. Could you imagine reading 1,800 pages in my version and turning around and being like, well, pi was wrong. That's what stood out.
It could be argued that there's a lot of parts in the Old Testament that are meant to be taken as, instruction manuals, like how long does it go through how exactly to construct the tabernacle? Like
Mhm.
it's
The
basically a whole
tabernacle, the
book.
chest plate, the ark, this
Yeah.
temple, like there's many spots where you could roughly reconstruct these crazy cool things that they're building, but at the end of the day, I feel like that wouldn't be where you'd put the exact measurements. Like, sure, you want to be literal, you want to be documentary, especially with the Torah rather, and but like this isn't where the builders are writing their stuff. Like, there's priests and there's architects, and they're not writing the same book. And to put the expectation of perfect, like, gospel and math is sort of stupid.
Yeah. And realistically, we don't know what the real purpose of this book was. Like, we don't know if they took these words and they sang them, or if they played them out like a Shakespeare play, or if they just, read them to one another sitting in a group, or if it was like whatever it was. We don't know, and it's ignorant for us to assume that, like, this is exactly what they wanted for us. Like, they could have just been, singing a tune and realized that, 31 doesn't rhyme as well as 30, so let's just round it a little bit.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it would have been one of those things where it's like the bowl's right there. You can measure the circumference. Like, it's perfect. Trust me, it's right over there. Grab a measuring tape. But in the meantime, I'm gonna write down 30 because I'm not so nitpicky.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they didn't plan on having the first temple get destroyed. When they made the first temple, they weren't planning on calling it the first temple. It was just the temple.
Yeah, exactly. It's the whole World War One fallacy. It's just like, you know what we called it back then? The war.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the temple doesn't get destroyed in First Kings, correct?
No, 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 no.
Okay.
No. Spoiler alert.
Wait, it gets destroyed?
I hate to ruin it for the kids at home.
This book opened with something interesting. We have David on his deathbed, right? And it says he can't get warm anymore, which is a symptom of getting old. You're unable to, like, generate metabolic heat, and so they go find him the prettiest virgin, even though he has numerous wives. I thought it was interesting that why his wives didn't hang out with him in bed to warm him up. They wanted this beautiful virgin.
You know
And
why.
it said he did not have sexual relations with that woman, but I'm thinking,
I've heard that one before. And it said he did not have sexual relations with that woman.
You're forgetting, Will.
Oh.
This is the word of God. This is written, okay? Like, when this is another one of those words when they say it is written, that is synonymous with this is the truth. This is a recorded accuracy that we have. So it is
Right.
written, so it is done. Like, just like the separation of church and state, we can think of them as two different things. But did they necessarily think of it as two different things? Like, we have this written record from our ancestors that we trust in, and the deity that they believe in and that they trust in. This is something that we have to take seriously. Oh, Synapsian left.
Well, I don't know. Like, quite frankly, I'm a little disappointed that Solomon had 1,000 wives, or David got a virgin to warm him up on his deathbed. It's all kind of really weird and toxic.
You could also say that, like, they say that they gave the virgin to David to warm him up at night. He didn't, like, request it. He was just sitting at home cold, like, oh, we know how to fix this guy. Let's get him a virgin. That'll cheer him up. And so he's just like, you know what? I don't really feel like it. Let's just cuddle. Or it was the lady coming out afterwards saying, "Oh, he was such a gentleman. He didn't even touch me. He was such a good guy," to make David seem all the more benevolent.
Or maybe
I
it's
don't know.
a sense of reflection,
Or
right?
maybe
By bringing the virgin to David, um, it kind of shows that he's no longer young anymore, and it's like, okay, this is what it was like back then. Maybe he will someday become young again in another life.
or maybe like they were just really sexually underdeveloped men that were kind of rapey. And they should have given women better rights. And like especially in Lebanon, like that place is just filled with kings. Remember that one passage they're like, "Oh yeah," and there was like 32 kings. And it's like everybody's a king? Like you're in one kingdom, you got 32 kings.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it's also funny
Let's
how the word like judge, ruler, king all pretty much
Prince.
have the exact same meaning. So like,
I don't know, man. It just kind of seems like men were running around back then with lots of gold and
yeah,
spices, and they were taking advantage of women, and they doesn't afraid of anything.
it's the will to power. Like, if you can
It's
become
mess.
if you can become like one king of your tiny little city in Lebanon, you know, you you don't care about there being a one unified king of the Middle East to unite you all. You just care about fulfilling your own will to power.
Well,
Yeah.
it's reflected that they don't care about the united um, Israel because we have a split. Israel and Judah
Yeah, with Jerusalem
split
right in the
up.
middle.
And that was a real boring section of the book, eh? Just the back and forth, back and forth, back.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Every other chapter ends with, "But is it not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or the books of the Acts of Solomon?" It's
Or the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And then
yeah.
it's like, also, I keep getting so confused because it's like when they say Israel, sometimes that means the entire peoples come out of Egypt. Other
Yeah.
times it means Israel. And then there's Judah. And then there's Benjamin. And at this point, I'm not even certain if Benjamin is even Israeli. Like,
Yeah,
it's so confusing.
there's so much speculation. Even Asimov talks about in his guide to the Bible how, there's a lot of scholars that don't think the Judah tribe was ever included in the Exodus, which is like, what? But that's one of the children of Jacob. You can't just say that wasn't, but like, how history gets fudgy and it gets complicated, and it could just very well be that, all of the Israelites came from the land of Judah. So like Jacob had his kids in Judah. All of the other sons went down to Egypt. Judah stayed where he was, and then when they all came back up, Judah's country was already, still established in the same spot, and then Israel started to surround it out. I don't know if there's any accuracy to that at all, but that's one of the theories and speculations that are out there. So
But then
whoever
isn't
wrote that,
Jerusalem
whoever
in
wrote,
Judah?
yeah, it's like right on the border. But there was also a capital before Jerusalem, aka Zion, that was in.
AKA David.
Yeah,
Explicitly, yeah, and we were living in the city of David slash Zion slash Jerusalem slash the Canaanites slash the milk of honey slash.
yeah,
Oh my
but
God.
it also makes me think like, with all of these weird uses of language, like, is it really talking about like all of these empires crushing each other and like these rival families battling it out, or is it like an allegory for a family squabble? Because you see over and over again like the father son narrative go wrong, like the son turning against the father, like in David and Saul, in like
David and
Jacob,
Absalom.
Jacob and all of his kids, and later on we get to Jesus and the Heavenly Father, that whole dichotomy there. And I think a lot of the Bible is talking about just these generational differences. Like when Plato talks about, the tyrant king giving birth to the democratic king, and the democratic king giving birth to the aristocratic king, and how these cycles keep going in this cycle, and there's really no escaping it until you actually conceptualize the whole cycle and try to insert something else in there that makes a little bit more sense, because we're just getting this huge pendulum swing between, oh, let's go off to the pagan ideology, let's go off to worshiping one god, pagans one god, pagans one god, back and forth, back and forth.
Well, and that's the problem with revolutionary societies, is that they don't know that the word revolution means circle.
Yeah.
What's a revolution? Like maybe not. We've done that 100 times. Maybe we could evolve.
Yeah.
Maybe we could transcend.
That's such an important message, in my opinion. Evolution, not revolution.
Speaking of the other gods they were worshiping, they referenced that they were making sacrifices at the high places. I didn't understand what those high places were.
Mountains.
Yeah, Asimov talks about some of that too, where like certain places were noted as belonging to certain deities. So there would be like a certain mountain where the Philistines traditionally worship the god of Dagon, and they would call that like, oh, that's Dagon's mountain. And previously, when they were talking about Mount Ephraim, or like the plains of Ephraim or the hills of Ephraim, it was saying like, oh, that's one of the places that belong to Yahweh, our one true God of our religion. So it's like when they go to these groves to worship all of these goddesses or Ashtaroth, or these mountains to worship all of these Baalim or whatever, the specific Dagon or Molech or Melkart or even Allah. Like I was watching one video who made the point that like the people in chapter 18 in that whole battle with like Elijah versus like all of the other hundreds of prophets against him, this guy John something on YouTube was making the case that they were all worshiping Allah, the moon god, because they took that out of one of these other temples. But I don't know, I thought that was kind of full of holes. Asimov said it was Melkart. I found some other sources online that say it was Dagon or Molech or whatever. Like there's hundreds of different renditions of this story. But yeah.
Well, and the fact is the Quran wasn't written for almost 1600 years.
Yeah, that was another part of like the mythology though, that when like Muhammad was choosing his deity, he walked into like an old ancient temple, picked one of the gods among the pantheon and said, Allah, that one looks good. He's the moon god. Mm-hmm. So he is going to be the one to reunite Islam. That's why like the symbol of Islam is like the crescent moon. It goes into like the story of how Muhammad rose to the heavens and split the moon in half, if you're familiar with that one. And yeah, just there's so many different ideas of what these other people were worshiping. Like we really don't have any idea.
There were two provocative things that they mentioned taking place during the worship of other gods. One was establishing Asheroth poles. And I didn't know what this was, but in my mind, I'm imagining like stripper poles.
Yeah, Ashtaroth is the word for like goddesses, like female deities, in the same way that Baalim is like the plural for male deities or gods. And Baal is the chief, and Asherah is like the chief goddess kind of thing.
So what were Asheroth poles?
Like basically just like totems or idols to say this is where we worship all of
Okay.
the Asheroth, or a singular Asherah.
Were they sexual objects?
I'm
The
not.
sacred tree or pole that stood near Canaanite religious locations to honor the Ugaritic mother goddess Asherah.
Yeah,
Okay, so it
it's
was a big
also
pole.
they're also described as like groves or like trees, like groups of trees where they would go and be like one with nature and say, "Ah, glory to the moon goddess or the earth goddess, Maya, whatever they were doing, Asherah." Asherah is an example of one of the singular chief deities of one of these religions, but when referring to multiple female deities, they would use the word Asheroth. So it's kind of complicated. They don't just add an S on the end for plurals like we do.
The second provocative thing was that they had male prostitutes at the shrine. I was wondering who visited these prostitutes. Was it the females, or was it the males in society visiting male prostitutes? Because it was meant to. They described these things as abominations to God, and was one of the reasons that led to the downfall of the various kings that followed Solomon.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't really pick up on that one.
I didn't either.
It called them by name. It said they were male shrine prostitutes.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, I missed that. We talking about the Sodomites?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, in my Bible, whenever the word sodomite came up in Kings, it literally defined it as male prostitutes,
Oh.
which I found to be quite interesting compared to, my connotation of the meaning of sodomy and sodomites.
Did they have male prostitutes in Egypt?
I think they had eunuchs, but I don't know about...
And the reason I ask is because in the later half of Solomon's rule, he kind of starts to resemble a pharaoh more than a king of Yahweh.
I was going to look into it for you, Jason, but then I decided it might not be the best idea to just simply Google Egyptian male prostitutes. And I just decided not to.
You'll end up on a list.
I've been searching some things, and that's not going in the list.
Make sure you put on incognito mode for that one. Oh, jeez.
Well, the part of this book that talks about Solomon was relatively short to the rest of the book, where it's describing all the other kings and their failing.
Well, you don't need to. You don't need to talk about Solomon that much when it's all written in the book of the Acts of Solomon.
Exactly.
Which we conveniently don't have anymore.
For me, the big thing was just the fascinating bit about the temple being built in Hiram, and I don't know. It's not interesting, it's not life-changing, it's not profound, it's not going to make me a better man having read Kings 1. I'm glad I read it. It's very nice to be able to get these references and just to be able to know what it means when someone talks about First Temple, to be able to have a general understanding of these books. Like in 2 Samuel, when you get all of the references for the song Hallelujah. And it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's nice to know that. Check. Reference complete. Move on.
I see you watched Synapsian and I's video.
I try to keep up. I try to. And it's nice to be a third of the way through the entire Holy Bible.
Yeah, really.
Which is where we're at. In 2 more books, we'll be halfway through, which is crazy.
Yeah, and also at the same time, it feels like we haven't even taken a chunk out of the Old Testament, but we're already halfway through the Bible.
Yeah. It's weird to put it in perspective, but those last 12 minor prophets are gonna happen real quick. It looks like there's lots in front of us, but in my version, I've read 603 pages of this freaking huge book.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much to go over.
What did you guys think of one of the prophets, Elijah, demonstrating the power of Yahweh when they built those altars? Of they cut up and sacrificed some bulls, and the Baal worshippers were said to be unable to like light it on fire.
Yeah, and they tried all day to the point of mutilation and mourning the fact that their god couldn't light the fire. And then Elijah comes along. He's like, "All right, soak it with water. Do it again. Do it a third time. All right, God, let's go." What a story.
Yeah. The first thing I thought of was like, that wasn't water. That was gasoline.
That's what I thought the whole time. Like, this is just olive oil.
No one else is looking. Light a little flint. Oh, look at it go! See how great my God is. Melkart ain't got nothing on Yahweh.
Honestly, like, that's one of those things where it's like hard to ratify a miracle that they just sprinkled into the text. Like, oh yeah, I mean, if that happened, God must really exist, but I wasn't there, and these words don't really prove anything to me.
Yeah, it's easy to look at it like that, but I just prefer to read it the same way I read any piece of literature. Just try to get inside their heads and perceive it as a story rather than an accounting of history, because reading it as an accounting of history just doesn't work. People have tried it. It's not going to go very well. We found way too much evidence to say the Exodus probably didn't happen. We have less than no evidence of it.
I hear you, and yet there are hundreds of millions of people who disagree.
Yeah, because like the story verse can be considered more important than, some things that may or may not have happened in the past.
But I'll tell you, at one point during the first book of Kings, near the end, when they were talking about all of the things Solomon did, in my head, the narrator started to sound like an adult talking to a child, and it read really well. As something that you could read to indoctrinate your children with. Like, it just felt like it was made to be read to a child. And like, oh, and then Solomon did this, and then it was this, and it was very exciting. Oh!
Yeah, but I don't really think you need that element of it for people to be united around a story. Like, the thing I keep thinking about was, remember a few years ago when everybody in Western civilization knew exactly what happened last week on Game of Thrones? Like, that's a story that's able to unite people. That was a mythology that people could participate in. That was a participatory thing that humans could enact and embody and say, hey, Westeros or Essos, do you like the Starks or the Lannisters more? Dany or Jon Snow? Like, it's always something that you could bring up in conversation and participate in over this story. Like, to say it was just a story is the biggest paradox I can think of. It's like, the same thing happened with, like, the summer of Pokemon Go. Everyone was united over a silly little mobile game. You see someone walking on the street, you say, hey, you see that horsey over there? Oh, yeah, good looking out. Moving on. Everyone's united over this story.
I hear that. But the problem is those stories didn't ask anything of you, and they didn't warn you of the pitfalls that would come if you didn't uphold the expectations put on you. You know what I mean? Like Game of Thrones, episode 1, incest. Like, what's the message there? There's no stories that have rules and suggested philosophies for life that people are getting behind. You know, like The Walking Dead. People love The Walking Dead, but it didn't make them better people.
Yeah.
And it's like, can't we have a story that isn't a total crock of shit and kind of encourages and inspires us to be better people? Like, can't we all just get on board with not raping, murdering, or stealing from people?
Yeah, but then the problem is, everybody is going to disagree on which story to use. Everyone's going to be more impacted by different stories.
But let's tell every story, but let's stick with
Yeah.
the same basic tenets.
Yeah, like some Joseph Campbell type shit, like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Star Wars isn't just a story of a moisture farmer who grew up to become a space wizard. Like that's not what
no
it's
one
about.
knows it. No one knows it as that, Scott. A moisture farmer.
Yeah, but that's exactly how people
who grew up to be a space wizard.
This is my point, though. This is exactly how people describe the Bible these days. At least a lot of atheists and how they describe the Bible. Oh, it's just how to live as a shepherd 6,000 years ago. Like, this isn't relevant to me. But it's just as relevant as Luke Skywalker on planet Tatooine carving out his own journey. Like, it doesn't have to be relatable for it to be impactful. It doesn't have to be about your life and what you should do with your life to gain perspective from, even a Batman story, or to learn with great power comes great responsibility from reading Spider-Man.
Or something about the Matrix trilogy, because it's super great too.
Exactly.
Or even films that inspire us to build better technology or explore among the stars. Like
No,
2000.
probably not that, Patrick. No, you're probably wrong.
Just throwing it out there.
I'm kidding. I just had to disagree with someone. I was running out of agreements.
Yeah, I was thinking after
Or Miyazaki.
Yeah. I was thinking after our last video on the Tower of Babel, how, like, God caused us all to scatter across the planet, but now that the whole planet has confounded languages, this is going to be the thing that triggers us to scatter across the solar system. Maybe trigger the whole Tower of Babel again from the whole solar system's perspective when the internet gets that much stronger.
That would be nice. I can't wait to colonize the universe.
There was something at the end of this First Kings book that I kind of found problematic, where it says the Lord sent deceiving spirits to trick the prophets of Ahab.
Mm-hmm.
What did you guys make of that? Like,
I mean, we've talked about this before. I'm pretty sure we all know my opinion that God in the Bible isn't, an agent physically telling people what to do. It's, all of these things happened afterwards were rationalized by God's will. So, like, and then later on in the New Testament, rationalized by the adversary. And, like, we could talk about the exact same thing in the story of the man of God. Like, we were talking about that one right before we started, where, God tells the man of God to go do this thing to Jeroboam, then leave, don't go back the way you came, and then as soon as, another prophet says to him, I'm a prophet too, but you must not have gotten the message. He told me to come, sweep you up, take you home, feed you, give you some wine. But he says, no, God told me that I shouldn't eat or drink until I'm out of the land of Judah. He says, no, it's okay. Trust me. God says it's okay. So he's like, all right, let's go. And then, after he has his full meal, he feasts with the old prophet, he leaves, lion comes and kills him. So, that could be easily interpreted as God saying, you didn't listen to me, I'm gonna kill you. Or it could be, the guy didn't do what he knew was right, so he got himself killed.
Or it could have all just been really random arbitrariness, and some guy got attacked by a lion, and he was someone's relative, and they included him in the book they were writing.
Yeah, well, it was like these books of Kings, like either 1 Kings to 4 Kings, or the first 2 books of Samuel and the 2 books of Kings. However you categorize these books, like I lost my train of thought.
I tossed Judges in there too, but this is all leading up
Oh,
to
yeah, right. They were all like, these 4 books were written by the same person, like King Josiah, and this man of God is introduced as the guy who predicts the coming of King Josiah. So Josiah could have just wanted to write a little tiny story about a guy that, predicted his coming and how he was going to split the altar of whatever and this and that. Like, a lot of it is just, like, I think of the storytelling and the editing process of going back over the story and making it look like you knew the
You knew what
ending
you were
from the
talking
start.
about.
Yeah.
right. I kind of feel that they're telling the story, the justification of why they got exiled from Zion. Ended up, spoiler alert, in the next book. I believe that they end up in like Babylonian exile. So whoever wrote this is just explaining why that happened, because they failed to make the prudent sacrifices for the future. They only looked for short-term gains, going to sleep with a prostitute or what have you, and they just weren't listening to the rules.
Yeah. It's kind of weird, just a little tangent off of that. I think it's kind of weird that, like, when you guys were talking about the male prostitutes and how they were, like, in my version of the Bible, it literally just says sodomites and doesn't give any other extra explanation. But it's kind of weird how, a sodomite previous in the Bible is described as, a person from the land of Sodom. That was what a sodomite was. But, that culture was known as being, wildly sexual and all this and all that. And then it happens again in the Bible where you have these people from the land of Samaria who were really nice to each other and, good neighbors. And today we have the word Samaritan, like, oh, he's a good Samaritan. It's just an artifact of these little cities from the Bible. So I don't know what to take away from that.
There's certainly a lasting impact.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of that impact and the extent of its tendrils in society is another question altogether. I have no belief that there is any more insight to wring from the corpse of Kings 1.
Are you sure about that?
No, I'm sure if I read it again, I would have another 45 minutes in me, but
just
for
at
my
this
first
time.
read through.
Yeah, the only other thing I have written in my notes is that Asimov talks about how we have a bunch of evidence of battles where the Assyrians and the Babylonians were winning battles against the Israelites, but, like, the only battles it really records in the biblical narrative are the ones that they were winning against Syria or against Judah, because they were all against each other. So, like, Asimov brings up this whole thing where, like, oh, history is always written by the victors no matter what, but, the Israelites lose quite a bit in this book. I don't know if you've been following it as closely as I have, but like,
Yeah.
just because they leave out some of the key battles that the Assyrians did record doesn't mean that they were being one-sided in their history, because, like Jason just mentioned, there's a Babylonian exile coming up, and then there's, Syrian occupation all throughout this book that we just read. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I keep saying. Like after you get through the Pentateuch, it's basically like 40 years of Israel is on top of things, 40 years of them being underneath things, 40 years on top, 40 years underneath, and then you get to Jesus. It's just back and
Yeah. Like that huge pendulum between the different forms of government or culture. It's all in its own little revolution. Never-ending revolution.
But again, if you're going to criticize the entire work of the Bible, don't start with the dimensions of the circumference of the Sea of Molten. Maybe point out the fact that a flaming pillar of light is a lot less likely.
Yeah.
Just go with the flow.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to wrap it all up. I think we've pretty much exhausted our current resources, so if you're new around here, check us out at www.bookwave.club, anchor.com to get all of the podcast links. We have a donation box down there if you're interested. We're on YouTube. And till next time, may the force be with you.
Or equal to mass times acceleration.
Good chat, lads.
Take care.